Sage of the Shadows, where dark whispers echo through the night.
Audio story. Blood Twins. Chapter 8. The Mill's Bloody Watchers. The old mill crouched like a predator awaiting its prey, its jagged edges softened by the veil of fog slithering through the trees. Moss and vines draped its crumbling stone walls, a feeble attempt by nature to reclaim the structure. The faint whisper of running water from the nearby stream intertwined with the eerie creak of loose boards and rusting machinery within. Time had gnawed at the mill, leaving behind a skeleton of its former purpose, but tonight, it served a new one, a staging ground for hunters training to kill those who lurked in shadows. The faint glow of lanterns dotted the camp surrounding the mill, illuminating the figures of hunters moving with steady purpose. Smoke curled lazily from the remains of a small fire near the outer perimeter, where a group of recruits sat huddled in hushed conversation. Their voices carried faintly, swallowed by the fog and muffled by the rustle of leaves overhead. Further out, more experienced hunters patrolled the area, their strides purposeful and their hands resting on weapons always within reach. The tension in the camp was palpable. These were not mere mercenaries. These were men and women trained for a singular purpose, to hunt and destroy. From their concealed vantage point within the dense forest, the vampires watched in silence, their stillness blending them seamlessly into the shadows. Arina, crouched low, her blue eyes fixed on the scene below, was as motionless as the surrounding trees. The flicker of lantern light glinted off her blade, its edge razor sharp even in the faint glow. The hunters moved with precision, their every step calculated, every glance betraying the weight of their task. Yet Arina's sharp gaze found their flaws, small cracks in their discipline, barely visible but unmistakable. "They're sloppy," she murmured on the second night, her voice no louder than a breath. Her eyes tracked a younger hunter struggling with his footing as he dragged a heavy crate into the mill's shadowy interior. The crate rattled as it bumped against uneven ground, drawing a sharp glance from one of the veterans nearby. The flicker of unease in the veteran's eyes was brief, but it was there. "You think everything's sloppy," Arina muttered from above, her voice lilting and sharp as a blade's edge. She perched on a branch, lounging as if they were gathered for a casual evening and not perched above a den of hunters armed with silver and stakes. "They are sloppy," Arina replied coolly, unmoving. "That's not a matter of opinion, it's observation. And that," Arina said with a soft, mocking laugh, "is why you're dull. You'd rather stare at their little mistakes than admit they're dangerous." Arina's jaw tightened, but her focus remained on the camp. "I never said they weren't dangerous. Mistakes make them vulnerable, not harmless. There's a difference. And yet, not long ago, you were eager to attack them alone. What happened to the confidence? Centuries of living done damage to your courage?" Arina's voice cut like frost. Togi, standing nearby, exhaled sharply, his broad frame leaning slightly against the trunk of a tree. His green eyes never stopped scanning the camp, but his voice carried the weight of someone used to managing friction. "Enough," he said, not looking at either of them. "We don't have time for this." But Arina smirked, undeterred. "Oh, we have plenty of time. We've been here for 2 nights already, haven't we? Just watching, waiting." Togi's hand flexed near the hilt of his knife. "Arina." "Enough." This time it was Arina, her voice soft but cutting. "Save your energy for the hunters." "Why?" Arina asked, leaning forward, her pale brown eyes narrowing. "How many centuries have our kind fought them, Arina? And now you're scribbling maps like they're untouchable. Tell me, where's all your bravery gone?" A faint growl rumbled from Arina's throat, but she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, her dagger sank into the earth, carving another line onto the map she had drawn. "Complacency gets people killed," she said, her tone even. "You want to throw yourself at them and hope for the best? Go ahead." "Tempting," Arina replied, her voice dripping with mockery. "But then who would be here to remind you that you're not as clever as you think?" "Arina." Togi's voice was low, but the warning in it was unmistakable. "You're not helping." Arina turned her cold smirk toward him. "Helping? Is that what we're doing here, Togi? Helping? If anything, we're just amusing ourselves, watching her pretend she's equal to you." "I don't pretend." Arina's voice was quiet, deadly. but you clearly pretend to be useful." Before Irina could respond, Togi stepped between them, his looming frame forcing Irina to lean back. "Enough," he repeated, his tone brooking no argument. "We're here to survive together." "Oh, definitely, we are," Irina murmured, her smirk fading into something sharper, colder. "All playing along with Arina, the vampire plucked from the streets. And we don't even know if we can trust her. Togi, have you even considered that she might have her own secret reasons for dragging us into this?" Togi's jaw tightened, but before he could reply, the rustling of leaves silenced them all. Kane and Corvin arrived, their sudden presence snapping the tension. Kane knelt near the map, brushing away damp leaves as he drew a line through the dirt with one gloved finger. "Traps on the south perimeter," he reported, his gravelly voice quiet but firm. "Stakes, rigged to spring if we cross certain thresholds. They've layered them, it'll take time to navigate." Corvin crouched beside him, the faint smirk on his lips failing to mask the sharpness in his silver eyes. "The north side's weaker," he added. "Rough terrain, but the traps and patrols are sparse. It's clear they don't expect anyone to bother with it." "They don't expect vampires to be clever," Kane said dryly. "That's their first mistake." Arina's crimson eyes narrowed as she studied the crude map. "Complacency," she murmured, her fingers tracing the line of traps near the south wall. "It'll kill them faster than we ever could." "I wouldn't bet on that." The voice came from Elias, who had appeared behind them with ghost-like silence. He crouched near the map, his gloved hand cradling a disarmed wooden stake. "Small operation or not, these traps are clever. Effective, a training ground with teeth." Irina, still lounging on her branch, tilted her head. "Maybe you should take notes, Arina. It seems hunters are much cleverer when all your centuries of experience are added together." "And yet," Arina replied, her voice dangerously soft, "their boldness will bring their deaths sooner rather than later." The air between them grew thick with unspoken challenge, but it was Togi who broke the silence this time. "We'll hit the north," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for debate. "The terrain's harder, but they've underestimated it. Arina, Kane, final recon. Corvin, Elias, dismantle any traps we missed. Irina." "Don't tell me," Irina interrupted, sliding down from the tree with predatory grace. "I get to keep everyone else alive when this all falls apart?" "No," Togi replied, his tone like iron. "You get to stop making trouble." For a moment, Irina stared at him, her pale lips curling into something resembling amusement, though her eyes were cold. Then she turned on her heels and disappeared into the shadows. The rest of the group exchanged wary glances but didn't speak. Togi stepped closer to Arina, lowering his voice. "She's testing you." "Then she'll need to try harder," Arina replied, though her fingers gripped her blade tighter. "She's watching how far she can push." "Irina's mostly harmless," Togi said quietly. "Remember that." Arina didn't respond. Instead, her gaze shifted back to the mill. The faint glow of lanterns flickered in the fog, marking their target. If there was any hesitation in her mind, she buried it deep. There was no room for doubt, not now. She was used to working solo. Arina had always preferred it that way, independent, sharp, and self-reliant. But Togi's sudden suggestion had thrown her off balance. The bitterness of that thought gnawed at her as she moved. She didn't need anyone to do this with her. She could strike down the hunter's base without help. She knew the risks. She knew how to deal with the hunters. They were nothing more than pests to be exterminated. But Togi, he'd insisted. Kane's presence in front of her was a quiet reminder of that fact. He was a solid, silent force, his movements smooth and sure. His figure was hard to make out in the shadows, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, always scanning, always aware. She was vaguely aware that he wasn't as unfamiliar with the terrain as she was. He was at home in the woods, a creature of this darkness. That much she could tell. But still, Arina didn't like it. She didn't trust him, and she certainly didn't want to rely on him. The silence between them stretched thin, a web of unspoken tension. She could feel the differences in the way they moved. Kane was calm, too calm for her taste. His every step was deliberate, measured. He's used to this, she thought, eyes narrowing as she watched him move ahead of her. "You're quiet," Kane said, his voice low but carrying in the stillness of the forest. Arina almost bristled at the tone, cool, detached, as though he'd been waiting for her to speak. She didn't need to be reminded of the awkwardness between them. "I don't like being here with you," she muttered, keeping her voice down, but there was no mistaking the edge. Cain didn't glance back at her. Instead, he kept his gaze forward, always looking for potential threats. "You're not the only one who isn't used to this." His voice remained even, but there was something like quiet understanding in it. "Doesn't mean we don't get the job done." Arina didn't respond at first, chewing on his words. She hated it, hated the idea of relying on anyone, especially someone she hadn't known long enough to trust. And yet, Togi's insistence weighed on her. She couldn't afford to make an enemy of the coven yet. She needed to be careful. The night was thick with fog, and the familiar weight of her dagger seemed too light in her hand. The hunter's base was close now. She could feel it, the pulse of their activity, the ebb and flow of patrols. "They won't be ready for us," she thought, a rush of cold certainty flooding her veins. "They never are." Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that her every move was being watched, judged. "You should be watching the path ahead, not me," Arina muttered after a few more moments of uneasy silence. Cain's response was almost imperceptible, just the slightest shift in the air around them as he readied himself. "You're distracted," he said flatly. "Your instincts are good, but you're not used to working in tandem. It shows." Arina's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. She could feel the truth of his words like an irritating itch beneath her skin. He was right. She wasn't used to working with others. Her instincts had been honed of solitude. "I don't need this," she thought, but the words didn't come out. "Let's get this over with," she finally said, her voice cold and clipped. She wasn't about to let Cain see any more cracks in her resolve. They pressed on, moving with a careful quietness that blended them with the shadows. As they neared the edge of the hunter's base, Arina's blue eyes flicked to the path ahead. The perimeter was patrolled, 2 guards stationed near the south entrance. The path up to the north side seemed clearer, though less protected. Arina's breath caught in her throat for just a moment. The feeling of isolation was still there, the prickling sense of unfamiliarity in every shadow. But she couldn't afford to think about it now. Arina crouched low behind a series of thick bushes, her eyes scanning the perimeter of the hunter's base. The fog wrapped around the structure like a heavy veil, shrouding the compound in a quiet menace. It was almost too easy to remain hidden, but she kept herself still, aware that any sudden movement could give her away. She didn't trust the fog to cover her completely. Her mind moved through a meticulous rhythm, cataloging every detail she could see. The 2 guards at the southern entrance were casual in their patrols, distracted by the light chatter between them. Arina's sharp eyes picked out their body language. Their movements were relaxed, but that meant nothing. A complacent guard was often the most dangerous. One wrong step, and we'd be in a fight we don't need, she thought. Her focus shifted to the building itself. It was an old structure, reinforced with metal and stone, but there were signs of decay, the rust on the hinges, the cracked windows, the overgrown vines. It had been here a long time, but the hunters had done their best to fortify it. Still, Arina could see weaknesses. Points where they were too hasty, too confident in their numbers. It was those flaws she would exploit. Minutes stretched on. Every muscle in her body screamed for action, but she held herself in check. Her dagger rested lightly against her side, but her mind stayed sharp. Time was on her side. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the patrols began to shift. The guards moved toward the southern gate, leaving a clear line of sight for her. Arina took a breath and began to move with calculated grace. She slipped from her hiding place, her steps silent on the soft ground. As she moved toward the northern side of the base, her eyes caught the distant forms of hunters preparing to make their rounds. She had to hurry. She needed to see the traps, their placement, the patterns, the weaknesses. As she reached the northern edge, her gaze swept over the area where the hunters had placed tripwires, bared traps, and cages meant to ensnare any unwary supernatural who wandered too close. But Arina was no novice. She knew how to slip past these things without a trace. Her fingers brushed over the metal of the traps, feeling the tension, the subtle shift in the air around them. It was a delicate balance. One wrong movement and she could trigger a chain of events that could bring down the entire operation. But she moved with the patience of someone who had spent far too many years honing the art of stealth. She disabled the traps with silent precision, each click of the mechanism a victory in its own right. After a few tense minutes, she stood in the middle of the hunter's defensive perimeter, knowing she had what she needed. She melted back into the shadows, retracing her steps with the same care and stealth. It was time to report back. The camp was cloaked in a still, heavy silence as Arina slipped from the shadows of the trees, her movements as quiet as a whisper. The night air was cool against her skin, the faint hum of crickets almost masking the soft crunch of leaves beneath her boots. Her body was sore from the long trek back, every muscle ached from the strain of the recon, but she moved with purpose, her mind already shifting back to the tense atmosphere waiting for her at the camp. Her comrades gathered in their usual quiet, discussing the next steps. As Arina approached, she made sure her steps were measured and slow, ensuring that she wasn't noticed. From the outskirts of the camp, she could see Togi and the others, their silhouettes sharp against the darkness. She paused behind a thick cluster of trees, hidden by the shadows, just far enough to listen without being seen. Irina's voice reached her first, sharp and laced with doubt, cutting through the air with a cold edge. "Are you sure we can trust her?" The words dripped with suspicion, each syllable a challenge. "Rogues like her, they're never a good sight. And for you to suggest working with her on something this big, the base, no less. What are you thinking?" Arina stiffened, her breath steady but the bitterness of Irina's words gnawing at the back of her mind. Carvin's voice, calm and amused, followed quickly, smooth as silk. "You forget, Arina, Togi doesn't make moves without knowing exactly what he's doing." There was a low chuckle at the end of the sentence, and the sound was like a dagger pressed against her chest. Togi remained silent for a beat. Arina could feel the tension building in the air, thick and sharp, as though the conversation was meant for her ears alone. Slowly, his voice cut through the silence, unhurried but laced with the weight of experience. "Right now, we need her." Arina's jaw tightened. She clenched her fists around the hilt of her blade, her body still vibrating with the adrenaline of the last few hours, but she held her ground, not allowing her anger to spill over. Irina's voice cut back in, low but forceful. "But we know each other. The squad, we understand each other's strengths, weaknesses. Arina? She's an unknown. How do we know she won't just walk in, destroy everything, and leave us in the dust?" Arina's eyes narrowed as she listened. The question wasn't unwarranted, she was unpredictable. That much was true. Togi's voice, quiet but undeniably authoritative, broke through once more. "She won't. I'll make sure of that." There was a pause. Arina could almost feel the weight of the silence in the air, thick with the tension of unspoken thoughts. Her chest tightened, but she refused to show any sign of it. She was used to being questioned, scrutinized. But something about Togi's certainty caught her off guard. Arina's breath evened out as she prepared to step forward, but before she could make her presence known, the moment stretched on. Her cold voice sliced through the tension. "If you think I'm here to betray you, you're wrong. The hunters are my problem." Irina's lips curled into a smirk, the disdain clear in her expression, but she said nothing more. The challenge between them was palpable, thick as smoke. Arina could feel it, a warning, a threat, but more importantly, a test. Irina would be watching, as she already did. Carvin's voice, lighter now but laced with a quiet amusement, added fuel to the fire. "She's silent," he remarked, a low chuckle under his breath. The sound of Irina's irritated huff reached Arina's ears, and she could picture the glare that would have been thrown in her direction. Carvin, however, was completely unfazed, his eyes gleaming with something closer to admiration than anything else. "We'll move on the base tomorrow," Togi said, his tone taking on the sharpness of finality. "And we do it together." Arina, still hidden in the shadows, allowed the quiet tension to settle over her. They were expecting her to fall in line, to do as she was told. But the way Togi had phrased it, it was almost a challenge in itself. It was clear now, he was offering her something she needed, but it came at a price. Arina's gaze flickered briefly toward the dim outlines of Togi's squad, Kane, Carvin, Elias, and Irina, before her attention returned to Togi. He wasn't offering her help because he cared. No, he had his own reasons, his own agenda.